The dog hit the basement door so hard the entire church shook. Not barked, not growled. Hit! Again, and again, and again. The old German shepherd slammed, his body against the thick wooden door beneath the church floor, with a desperation that made every person standing there freeze. The floodwater had only receded 3 days earlier. Nobody had even known the basement existed until then. But the retired K9 seemed to know exactly where it was, and whatever was hidden behind that locked door had turned a calm, aging police dog into something nobody in town recognized, because when a volunteer tried to pull him away, the dog bit through the leash, then threw himself at the door again, as if he was trying to stop something, or warn them. And what they eventually discovered beneath that church would force an entire Louisiana town to question a story they had believed for nearly 40 years. The town was called Delacroix Crossing. Most Americans had never heard of it. Even in Louisiana, people often drove past the place without noticing. Tucked deep inside St. Landry Parish, surrounded by bayous, cypress groves, and miles of marshland, Delacroix Crossing felt trapped between decades. The town had one gas station, one grocery store, one school, and one church. The church sat on slightly elevated ground near the center of town. Officially, it was called Mercy River Chapel, a white wooden structure built in 1952. Locals simply called it the chapel. It had survived hurricanes, storms, economic collapse, and population decline. By 2024, fewer than 600 people lived in Delacroix Crossing. Most residents knew every face in town. Most secrets stayed hidden until the flood. It started after nearly 2 weeks of relentless rain. The bayous swelled beyond anything locals had seen in years. Drainage canals overflowed. Roads disappeared. Entire sections of marshland transformed into inland lakes. Then one night, a levee several miles north failed. The water came fast. By sunrise, much of Delacroix Crossing sat underwater. People evacuated, boats replaced trucks, generators hummed across rooftops. When the water finally receded, the town looked wounded. Mud-coated streets, trees lay uprooted, homes carried water lines halfway up their walls. And beneath Mercy River Chapel, something unexpected emerged. A section of earth behind the church had collapsed. The flood had washed away decades of packed soil. What remained was a partially exposed concrete foundation nobody remembered seeing before. At first, townspeople assumed it was simply an old utility room, but when volunteers cleared debris, they discovered stone steps descending underground. The church records contained no mention of a basement, yet when workers showed him the exposed stairwell, he looked genuinely confused. "I've never seen that before," he said. People believed him, at least initially. Meanwhile, another resident had returned to town after the evacuation. His name was Boone Mercer. Boone was 48, a former K9 handler with the Louisiana State Police. Years earlier, a roadside bomb investigation had left him with severe injuries. He retired early, divorced, moved back to his hometown, and spent most days repairing fishing equipment and helping neighbors. His closest companion was a retired police dog named Gideon. Gideon wasn't young anymore. At 11 years old, the German shepherd moved slower than he once had. Gray fur spread across his muzzle. Arthritis affected his hips. Most days he preferred sleeping on Boone's porch. The dog had spent nearly 8 years working narcotics, detection and search operations. His career was long over, or so Boone thought. The morning everything changed, Boone volunteered to help clean debris around the church. Gideon accompanied him. Nobody paid much attention to the dog at first. Workers carried broken lumber. Volunteers removed mud. Teenagers hauled ruined furniture from storage rooms. The atmosphere felt hopeful despite the destruction. Then Gideon stopped moving. The dog froze near the newly exposed stairwell. His ears rose. His posture changed. Boone noticed immediately. Old habits, years of partnership, had taught him exactly when Gideon was detecting something unusual. The dog's nose lifted. He sniffed once, twice. then pulled toward the staircase. Boone frowned. "Easy, buddy." Gideon ignored him. The shepherd descended the steps, slowly at first, then faster. Boone followed. At the bottom stood a narrow concrete corridor. Flood debris covered the floor. Water stains coated the walls. The passage ended at a heavy wooden door reinforced with iron hinges. The door was locked. Gideon reached it and instantly became agitated. Not excited, agitated. The distinction mattered. His tail stiffened. His breathing accelerated. He began scratching aggressively. Boone tried redirecting him. Nothing worked. Then Gideon started barking. The sound echoed through the underground corridor. People above heard it. Several volunteers came downstairs. Everyone watched. Nobody understood, because this wasn't ordinary behavior. Retired canines sometimes reacted to sense, but Gideon looked terrified and determined, as though something beyond that door demanded immediate attention. Boone knelt beside him. The dog pressed against the wood. Whining now? Desperate. Boone placed a hand on the door. It felt cold, strangely cold, despite the Louisiana summer heat. "What's in there?" someone asked. Nobody answered, because nobody knew. The church trustees arrived later that afternoon. After some discussion, they decided not to force the door open. The building was already structurally compromised. Engineers hadn't inspected the foundation. Opening unknown spaces could be dangerous. The decision seemed reasonable. The door would remain closed until professionals examined it. Most people accepted that. Gideon did not. The next morning, before sunrise, Boone woke to an unfamiliar sound, his front gate creaking. He stepped onto the porch and froze. Gideon was gone. The dog had never wandered. Not once in 11 years. Boone grabbed his truck keys. 20 minutes later, he found Gideon, sitting alone outside Mercy River Chapel, covered in mud, facing the basement stairwell, waiting. And when Boone approached, the old shepherd stood, looked toward the hidden door beneath the church, and released a low growl that Boone had not heard since their final years in law enforcement. A growl that said one thing: something was very, very wrong, and whatever Gideon had detected beneath Mercy River Chapel, it wasn't going away. Boone had spent nearly a decade reading Gideon, not just the obvious signals, not barking versus silence, not excitement versus fear. He meant the tiny things, the subtle shifts, the almost invisible changes that separated an ordinary reaction from a working dog alert. And what he saw in Gideon over the next 3 days unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. The dog barely slept. He ignored favorite toys, ignored treats, ignored other people. Every morning before Boone even finished coffee, Gideon positioned himself by the truck, waiting, demanding. The destination never changed: Mercy River Chapel. At first, Boone assumed the dog had picked up some lingering scent trapped by the flood. Dead wildlife wasn't uncommon after major flooding. Neither were chemical leaks. Fuel tanks ruptured. Storage sheds collapsed. Flood water carried all kinds of strange odors. Maybe something beneath the church had become trapped underground. Maybe Gideon was reacting to that. It was the simplest explanation. The problem was that Gideon wasn't behaving like he had detected a dead animal. Boone had seen that countless times during search operations. This was different. The dog wasn't identifying something. He was trying to reach something, or prevent someone from reaching it first. By Friday afternoon, the story had spread through town. In a place as small as Delacroix Crossing, unusual events traveled fast. People stopped Boone at the grocery store, at the gas station, even while filling sandbags left over from flood recovery. "That dog still acting crazy? Think there's somebody trapped down there? Maybe there's an old crypt. Maybe the church buried something years ago." Everyone had theories. None made much sense. Meanwhile, county inspectors finally arrived. The town gathered near the church as engineers examined the exposed foundation. Boone stood beside Reverend Clayton Voss and watched. The elderly pastor looked exhausted. The flood had damaged both the church and the small parsonage where he lived. Dark circles hung beneath his eyes, yet something else bothered Boone. Every time someone mentioned the basement, Clayton became uncomfortable. Not fearful, not defensive, uncomfortable, as if the discovery itself annoyed him. Around noon, an engineer named Curtis Landry emerged from the stairwell. "The structure's stable," he announced. Relief swept through the crowd. "Can we open the door?" someone asked. Curtis shrugged. "No reason not to." That immediately changed the atmosphere. People moved closer. Conversations grew louder. Even Gideon reacted. The old shepherd rose from beneath a nearby oak tree and stared toward the stairwell. Every muscle tightened. Boone felt a knot form in his stomach. Something about the dog's reaction felt wrong. Curtis and two workers descended the steps carrying tools. The crowd waited. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Finally, a loud metallic crack echoed from below. The lock had broken. Everyone leaned forward, expecting answers. Instead, they got confusion. The workers emerged looking puzzled. "Well?" someone asked. Curtis rubbed the back of his neck. "There's another wall." "What?" "A brick wall." People exchanged looks. "What do you mean, another wall?" "The door opens," Curtis explained. "But about 6 feet behind it, somebody built a solid brick barrier." Silence followed. Nobody expected that. A hidden basement was strange enough. A hidden basement with a sealed inner chamber was something else entirely. Questions erupted immediately. Who built it? Why? When? Reverend Clayton looked genuinely shocked. "I've never heard of that." Neither had anyone else. The county engineers decided additional excavation would be required before disturbing the barrier. No one knew what structural role it might serve. Again, caution won. Again, the mystery remained unsolved. And again, Gideon became increasingly agitated. That evening, Boone sat on his porch watching the sunset bleed orange across the marshes. Gideon lay nearby, or at least appeared to. The dog hadn't closed his eyes for more than a few minutes all day. Every so often he would lift his head and stare toward town, toward the church, as though listening for something invisible. Boone finally spoke. "What are you trying to tell me?" Gideon looked up. For a moment Boone felt ridiculous, talking to an aging police dog, expecting answers. Yet the feeling wouldn't leave. Something wasn't right. Around 9 o'clock his phone rang. The caller ID displayed a familiar name. Nora Bellamy. She owned the local newspaper. Calling it a newspaper was generous. The Delacroix Weekly consisted of 4 pages, and barely enough advertising revenue to survive. But Nora loved journalism, even if most stories involved fishing tournaments and school fundraisers. "You heard what happened?" she asked. "What happened where?" "At the church." Boone sat upright. "What now?" "Somebody broke in." He was already reaching for his keys. 20 minutes later, blue lights illuminated Mercy River Chapel. Only 2 deputies served the entire area. Both stood near the entrance talking to witnesses. Nora waited nearby holding a notebook. "What happened?" Boone asked. She pointed toward the basement stairs. "Somebody tried getting through the brick wall." Boone frowned. "How?" "They brought tools." His eyes narrowed. "Did they get inside?" "No." According to investigators, someone had entered the church after dark. The intruder went directly to the basement. Not the sanctuary, not donation boxes, not offices. Straight to the hidden corridor. Then attempted breaking through the brick barrier. They failed, but not because they ran out of time. Something interrupted them, something that left everyone even more confused. The deputies led Boone downstairs. Flashlights illuminated fresh damage. Several bricks had been chipped. Dust covered the floor. Then Boone noticed the claw marks. Deep scratches stretched across the damaged bricks. Not from tools. From a dog. Gideon immediately pulled toward them, sniffing intensely. Boone crouched beside the marks. The pattern looked familiar. Very familiar. Too familiar. One deputy folded his arms. "We found blood." "Human?" "Small amount." The deputy pointed toward a broken section of brick. "Looks like whoever was working down here cut themselves." Boone studied the area. Then his stomach tightened, because another detail suddenly stood out. The blood wasn't fresh anymore. It had dried, meaning the intruder had likely arrived hours before discovery. Yet there was something odd about the scene. If someone desperately wanted access behind the wall, why stop after creating such a small opening? The answer arrived the next morning, and it changed everything. At sunrise, a fisherman named Randall Price called authorities. He had discovered a boat abandoned near a flooded drainage canal 2 miles outside town. Inside the boat sat a backpack, a crowbar, a hammer, and documents belonging to a local man named Wesley Fontenot. The discovery shocked Delacroix Crossing, not because Wesley was dangerous. Quite the opposite. Wesley was 43, quiet, friendly, a history teacher at the local school. People trusted him, liked him. Yet when deputies arrived at his house, Wesley was gone. His truck remained parked outside. His wallet sat on the kitchen counter. His phone rested beside the sink. The man had simply vanished. Within hours, rumors exploded across town. Maybe Wesley had broken into the church. Maybe he discovered something. Maybe he got trapped underground. Maybe he fled. Nobody knew, but the timing was impossible to ignore. Then investigators uncovered an even stranger detail. According to neighbors, Wesley had become obsessed with church records shortly after the flood. He had spent days reviewing old property documents, interviewing elderly residents, digging through archives, almost as if he had been searching for something or someone. And suddenly the mystery wasn't just about a basement anymore. Now there was a missing man, a sealed chamber beneath a church, an unknown intruder, and a retired police dog who refused to leave the scene. But late that night, Gideon did something that convinced Boone the answers weren't inside the church alone. Because for the first time since the flood, the old shepherd walked away from Mercy River Chapel, then headed directly into the swamp, as if he had finally found a trail, and wherever it led, someone clearly didn't want it followed. Boone followed Gideon into the swamp just after midnight. The old German shepherd moved with surprising purpose. His age showed in the stiffness of his gait, but the determination was unmistakable. Moonlight reflected across floodwater pooled between cypress trees. Mosquitoes swarmed. Mud sucked at Boone's boots. Still, Gideon pressed forward. The trail led away from town, away from the church, away from everything that seemed connected to the mystery. At least at first. Boone clicked on a flashlight. Gideon, the dog, ignored him. 20 yards later, Gideon stopped beside a cluster of partially submerged trees. His nose worked rapidly. Then he circled. Once, twice. Finally, he sat. Boone's pulse quickened. That wasn't random behavior. It was an old indication response from the dog's working years. The signal meant one thing: find something here. Boone swept the flashlight beam across the ground. At first he saw nothing unusual. Then the light reflected off metal. Half buried beneath mud sat a rusted lockbox. The flood had apparently unearthed it. Boone pulled it free. The box was small, old, water damaged. Its lock had already broken. Inside were several soaked papers. Most had been ruined. The ink had dissolved into unreadable stains. But one item survived: a faded photograph. Boone stared at it. The image showed Mercy River Chapel. Sometime during the late 1980s, several church members stood outside smiling for the camera. Nothing strange there. Then he noticed one face: a young Reverend Clayton Voss, standing beside another man Boone didn't recognize. Written on the back was a single name: Elias Rourke. Boone frowned. The name meant nothing to him, yet Gideon had somehow led him to the box. That couldn't be coincidence. The next morning, Boone visited Nora Bellamy. If anyone could identify an obscure local name, it was the town's unofficial historian. Nora adjusted her glasses while examining the photograph. For several seconds she said nothing. Then her expression changed. That's impossible. What? She pointed at the unknown man. Elias Rourke. You know him? I know who he was. Boone leaned forward. Nora opened a filing cabinet and began searching. A few moments later she produced an old newspaper clipping. The paper had yellowed with age. The headline read, "Local contractor missing after boat accident. Date, August 17th, 1987. According to the article, Elias Rourke had disappeared while traveling alone through nearby wetlands. Authorities assumed his boat overturned during a storm. His body was never found. The case eventually went cold. Boone studied the article. Contractor? Nora nodded. He worked construction projects all over the parish. Any connection to the church? Not that I know of. The answer created more questions than it solved. Why would a missing contractor appear in a church photograph? Why would evidence connected to him be hidden in the swamp? And why had Gideon located it? Before Boone could pursue those questions, another development rocked Delacroix Crossing. Deputies discovered Wesley Fontenot's truck keys. Not at his house, not near the church, inside the church basement. The keys had somehow been overlooked during the initial search. Their location immediately intensified speculation. Now people became convinced Wesley had entered the hidden chamber. Perhaps he had found a way through the brick wall. Perhaps he had become trapped. Search teams returned to the church. This time they brought specialized equipment. Ground-penetrating radar, structural scanners, additional engineers. The results stunned everyone. Behind the brick barrier existed a room, a large room, far larger than expected. Nearly 40 feet long, 20 feet wide, completely sealed. The discovery electrified the town. Reporters from neighboring counties began arriving. Social media exploded with theories. Hidden vault, forgotten bunker, bootlegging operation, Cold War shelter. Everyone had an explanation. Almost all of them were wrong. As workers prepared to carefully breach the wall, Boone continued investigating Elias Rourke. The more he learned, the stranger things became. Rourke hadn't merely worked around Delacroix Crossing. He had spent almost 2 years renovating Mercy River Chapel during the mid-1980s. Church financial records confirmed it. So did old photographs. Yet nobody currently attending the church remembered hearing his name. Even more troubling, Boone discovered inconsistencies in the timeline of Rourke's disappearance. According to official records, he vanished in August 1987. Yet multiple invoices showed he completed church work several weeks after that date. Someone's records were wrong, or someone had altered them. That afternoon, Boone visited Reverend Clayton. The elderly pastor listened quietly while Boone described the discrepancies. For a long time, Clayton said nothing. His face looked unusually pale. Finally, he sighed. "I was hoping none of this would resurface." Boone's attention sharpened. "What does that mean?" Clayton stared through the window, out toward the flooded fields. 40 years is a long time. "You knew Elias." "Yes." "Then tell me about him." The old pastor hesitated, then spoke softly. "Elias wasn't just a contractor." Boone waited. "He was my friend." The admission hung in the air. "Why wasn't that mentioned anywhere?" Clayton rubbed his forehead. "Because after he disappeared, people started talking." "What kind of talking?" "Rumors." The pastor's voice lowered. "Missing money. Property disputes. Accusations." "Against who?" Clayton looked directly at him. "The church." Boone felt a chill. Clayton continued. "Nothing was ever proven. The sheriff investigated. Case closed." "But you don't believe that." The pastor didn't answer immediately. Finally, he whispered, "No." That single word changed everything. Before Boone could ask more questions, a deputy burst into the room, out of breath, clearly rattled. "They opened it." "What?" "The chamber." Within minutes, half the town gathered outside Mercy River Chapel. Workers had finally removed enough bricks to create an entry point. Floodlights illuminated the opening. Everyone waited. Nobody spoke. The atmosphere felt heavy, anticipatory, like standing on the edge of something irreversible. The first engineer crawled inside, then a second. Minutes passed. Silence. Then voices, excited voices. Soon the workers emerged, looking confused rather than triumphant. Boone immediately knew something unexpected had happened. "What is it?" someone shouted. The lead engineer hesitated, then answered. "It's empty." The crowd erupted. "What do you mean empty?" "There are shelves, storage racks, old electrical equipment, but nothing else." Disappointment spread quickly. After all the speculation, the hidden chamber appeared to be nothing more than a forgotten maintenance room. People exchanged frustrated looks. Had the entire mystery really led to this? A sealed room full of abandoned equipment? Boone wasn't convinced. Neither was Gideon. The moment the dog entered the chamber, his behavior changed again. He ignored the shelves, ignored the walls, ignored the equipment. Instead, he moved directly to the far corner, then began scratching violently at the concrete floor. Workers attempted pulling him away. The old shepherd fought them hard. Boone arrived and knelt beside him. "What is it?" Gideon continued digging. Concrete dust scattered. His paws scraped one specific section repeatedly. Boone examined the surface. At first it appeared normal. Then he noticed a faint outline, a rectangular seam, barely visible, almost perfectly concealed. His heartbeat accelerated. "Get me a pry bar." An engineer brought one. Boone inserted the metal edge into the seam, applied pressure. Nothing. Then more pressure. A loud crack echoed through the chamber. The section shifted. Gasps erupted around him, because the floor wasn't solid concrete. It was a hatch, hidden beneath decades of dust. A hatch nobody had detected. A hatch leading somewhere even deeper. And as workers lifted it open, a rush of stale air escaped from below. The smell was unmistakable. Not decay, not mold. Paper. Old paper? Thousands of pages worth. Then somebody shined a flashlight down. Rows of metal filing cabinets stretched into darkness. An entire underground archive hidden beneath the hidden room. But the biggest surprise wasn't the archive itself. It was the name stamped onto the nearest cabinet door. A name that nobody in Delacroix Crossing had heard in almost 40 years. Elias Rourke. And suddenly, the contractor everyone believed had died in 1987 seemed far more important than anyone had imagined. The moment Boone saw the name on the cabinet, he understood one thing. The hidden chamber had never been the secret. It had been protecting the secret. Within an hour, deputies secured the church grounds. Nobody entered the underground archive without authorization. That didn't stop rumors. By sunset, Delacroix Crossing had transformed into a town running almost entirely on speculation. People gathered outside the grocery store, at fishing docks, around church parking lots. Everyone wanted answers. Everyone had a theory. Yet nobody was prepared for what investigators found inside the archive. The underground room stretched far beyond the footprints shown by the structural scans. At some point during the 1980s, someone had excavated a large section beneath the church property and concealed it. Beneath layers of construction, the workmanship was professional, careful, expensive, not something built in secret over a weekend. Rows of filing cabinets filled the space. Thousands of documents sat inside waterproof containers. Many remained remarkably preserved despite decades underground. At first, investigators expected financial records, church paperwork, construction plans. Something ordinary. Instead, they discovered something far stranger. Every cabinet contained research, detailed research, maps, land surveys, hydrology reports, property records, floodplain studies, engineering assessments, environmental data. The collection covered nearly 30 years, and almost every document focused on one topic: water. Specifically, the movement of water throughout St. Landry Parish. Boone stood beside Nora Bellamy as investigators reviewed the findings. Neither spoke for several moments. Finally, Nora broke the silence. Why would a church hide this? Boone didn't answer, because he was asking himself the exact same question. The next surprise arrived the following morning. One cabinet contained hundreds of cassette tapes, each carefully labeled. Dates, locations, interview subjects, names. Among those names appeared local residents, former parish officials, engineers, business owners, and repeatedly, Elias Rourke. Investigators managed to restore one of the recordings. The audio crackled with age. A man's voice filled the room, confident, methodical, determined. This is Elias Rourke, August 12th, 1987. Everyone listened. If anything happens to me, these records need to survive. The room fell silent. The voice continued. I have completed verification of the flood diversion surveys. Boone exchanged a glance with Nora. Flood diversion? Elias continued. The maps confirm unauthorized alterations to regional drainage systems over the last 15 years. Several investigators frowned. The recording continued. Entire communities have been placed at increased risk. Then the tape ended. Just like that. No explanation. No details. Only questions. More tapes followed, each revealing fragments. References to drainage projects, levees, private land purchases, environmental assessments. But no complete picture. Then another discovery changed everything. Hidden among the files was a modern document, not from the 1980s. Not even old. It had been printed less than 6 months earlier. Everyone immediately noticed the significance. Someone had accessed the archive recently, very recently. The document contained updated flood modeling data, predictions, risk assessments, maps showing potential levee failures. One location was highlighted repeatedly, Delacroix Crossing, specifically the levee that had collapsed weeks earlier. The same levee responsible for flooding the town. The room grew quiet. Boone felt his stomach tighten because the report wasn't predicting a possible failure. It was warning of a probable failure months before it happened. Someone knew. Someone had known for a long time and done nothing. At least that appeared to be the implication. By afternoon, state investigators joined the case. Now the mystery expanded beyond a hidden church chamber, beyond a missing contractor, beyond a missing teacher. Questions reached parish government offices, engineering departments, regional water authorities. Then came the twist nobody expected. One of the restored recordings contained a familiar voice. Reverend Clayton Voss. The elderly pastor sat in stunned silence as investigators played the tape. The recording dated back to 1987. Elias spoke first. Then Clayton responded. Young, nervous, afraid. You can't release this. People need to know. They'll destroy you. They already tried. The recording ended there. Short, incomplete, yet explosive. Suddenly suspicion shifted toward Clayton. Residents who had trusted him for decades began asking uncomfortable questions. Had he hidden the archive? Had he helped conceal evidence? Had he known about the secret all along? The pastor denied nothing. That was perhaps the strangest part. He simply looked tired, as though a burden he had carried for 40 years was finally collapsing under its own weight. That evening, Boone confronted him, not angrily, directly. The two men sat inside the damaged sanctuary while workers continued excavating below. Sunlight filtered through stained glass. Dust drifted through the air. For a long time, neither spoke. Finally, Boone asked, "How much did you know?" Clayton stared at the altar. "Almost everything." The answer landed like a punch. Boone's jaw tightened. "You told everyone you'd never seen the basement." "I hadn't." "What?" "The basement wasn't the secret." The pastor looked up. "The archive was." Boone waited. Clayton exhaled slowly. Then the story finally began emerging. Back in the mid-1980s, Elias Rourke had been hired during a church renovation. While working on drainage systems, he uncovered irregular survey records. At first he ignored them. Then he became curious. The deeper he investigated, the more concerned he became. Certain flood control projects didn't match official plans. Canals had been redirected, waterways altered. Flood risks shifted from some properties onto others. Entire communities became vulnerable. Meanwhile, certain privately owned lands benefited enormously. Property values increased. Development opportunities expanded. Money flowed. Lots of money. Elias believed powerful people had manipulated regional water infrastructure for decades. He spent years gathering evidence. Then he became frightened because people started following him, threatening him, warning him. According to Clayton, Elias approached the church seeking help. Not because of religion, because he needed somewhere secure, somewhere nobody would think to search. Together they built the hidden archive, not to hide evidence forever, to preserve it until the right moment. Then Boone asked the obvious question. What happened to Elias? The pastor's eyes filled with sadness. I don't know. For the first time, Boone believed him completely. Then another question emerged. If you knew all this, why stay silent? Clayton's answer came immediately. Because Elias vanished. The pastor swallowed hard. And a week later, someone broke into my home and left a message. Boone leaned forward. What message? Clayton's voice barely rose above a whisper. The archive survives only if the story dies. Silence followed. 40 years. 40 years carrying that threat. 40 years protecting a secret. 40 years waiting. But one mystery remained. The biggest mystery. Wesley Fontenot, the missing teacher. Nothing in the archive explained his disappearance. Nothing connected him directly to Elias. Yet Wesley had clearly been searching for the chamber. Searching for answers. Searching for something. Then Gideon found the clue that changed everything. Late that night, while investigators cataloged documents, the old shepherd slipped away. Boone discovered him outside the church cemetery. The dog stood beside a neglected grave near the far fence line, a grave nobody had visited in decades. Its marker had partially sunk into the ground. Mud from the flood exposed part of the foundation beneath it. Gideon began pawing at the soil again and again and again. Boone knelt beside the marker, then brushed away accumulated dirt. The inscription emerged. His blood ran cold, because the grave didn't belong to a church member, or a local family, or anyone from Delacroix Crossing. The headstone carried only a name, Elias Rourke, and a death date, August 18th, 1987. One day after his official disappearance. But the biggest shock wasn't the grave. It was what Boone noticed next. The stone wasn't weathered. It only looked weathered. Someone had artificially aged it. The marker wasn't 40 years old. It was recent, very recent, which meant someone had secretly installed a fake grave sometime within the last few years. And if someone recently created a false burial site for a man who supposedly died decades ago, there was only one logical possibility. Elias Rourke might never have died at all. And somewhere out there, the missing teacher Wesley Fontenot may have discovered exactly where he was. The fake grave changed the entire investigation. Up until that moment, everyone had been focused on the past. The flood, the archive, the church, the disappearance of Elias Rourke in 1987. But now investigators faced a disturbing possibility. Someone connected to the mystery was still active, still hiding evidence, still manipulating the story, and maybe watching everything unfold. The next morning, state investigators removed the headstone. Their examination confirmed Boone's suspicion almost immediately. The marker wasn't decades old. The stone had been artificially treated with chemicals to mimic age and weather damage. Even more revealing, traces of modern cutting equipment were found along its base. Someone had installed it recently, very recently, probably within the last 3 years. The question was obvious. Who? And why? Meanwhile, Gideon refused to leave the cemetery. The old shepherd spent hours pacing between the fake grave and the church. Back and forth, as though the two locations were connected. Boone trusted the dog enough to pay attention. The behavior reminded him of old search operations. Sometimes Gideon would repeatedly move between 2 points when attempting to establish a relationship between them, a route, a pattern, a connection. Boone decided to follow. He started at the grave, then slowly traced the direction Gideon repeatedly traveled. The path led through a cluster of old oak trees behind the cemetery, toward an abandoned maintenance shed partially hidden by flood debris. The structure belonged to the church. At least officially. Nobody had used it in years. The flood had damaged part of the roof. One wall leaned noticeably. Most people ignored it. Gideon didn't. The dog immediately began scratching at the door. Boone entered. Dust covered everything. Broken shelves, rusted tools, discarded lumber. Nothing unusual. Then Gideon moved to the rear wall. The shepherd began sniffing aggressively. Boone approached. Something felt wrong. The wall sounded hollow. A closer inspection revealed fresh screws hidden beneath old paint. His pulse quickened. Minutes later, investigators removed the panel. Behind it sat a narrow storage space. Inside were 3 plastic containers. Waterproof, recently sealed. Everyone gathered around as the first container opened. The room fell silent. Inside were journals. Dozens of journals. Everyone signed with the same name, Elias Rourke. The entries spanned nearly 4 decades. The earliest dated 1985. The most recent, 8 months earlier. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved, because there was now no doubt. Elias Rourke had survived. Somehow. Somewhere. And he had continued documenting events for 40 years. The journals revealed an astonishing story. After uncovering evidence of manipulated flood control projects, Elias became convinced powerful individuals would destroy both him and the archive. Then came the threats, surveillance, intimidation, attempts to seize his records. Eventually, he staged his own disappearance. Only a handful of people knew. One of them was Clayton. Another twist emerged quickly. The conspiracy Elias feared wasn't what most people imagined. There was no criminal empire, no cartel, no secret society. The truth was both simpler and more disturbing. Over several decades, a small network of engineers, contractors, developers, and local officials had repeatedly approved projects, benefiting private interests at the expense of vulnerable communities. Not through one grand scheme, through hundreds of small decisions, each individually defensible, collectively devastating. Flood risks were quietly shifted, reports minimized, warnings ignored. Certain landowners profited, other communities paid the price, including Delacroix Crossing. The levee collapse wasn't an accident in the traditional sense. It had been predictable, preventable, and repeatedly documented. Yet one question remained unanswered. Where was Elias now? The answer arrived that same afternoon. Investigators reached the final journal. The last entry contained directions, coordinates, and a note. "If you are reading this, Wesley found me." Boone felt a chill run through his body. The room became completely silent. The note continued. "He came because he uncovered what happened to the levee. He believed the flood exposed the archive. He was right. We agreed the truth could no longer remain hidden. But if he failed to return, something went wrong. Find him first, then find me." The coordinates pointed toward a remote section of wetlands, nearly 20 miles from town. Within hours, search teams mobilized. Boone insisted on joining. So did Gideon. The journey took most of the day. The location sat deep within marshland, inaccessible by road. Boats navigated narrow channels created by the flood. Finally, near sunset, they found it. A small cabin, weathered, isolated, hidden among cypress trees. The structure looked abandoned, but it wasn't. Someone lived there. Investigators approached cautiously. The front door stood partially open. Inside, they found evidence of recent occupancy: food, books, medical supplies, stacks of documents. Then a voice emerged from the back room. "You're late." Everyone froze. A frail, elderly man stepped into view. His hair was white, his shoulders stooped, his face lined with age. Yet Boone recognized him instantly. The photographs, the recordings, the journals. Elias Rourke, alive at 81 years old. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then Boone asked the question haunting everyone. "Where's Wesley?" Elias closed his eyes. Relief crossed his face. "He's alive." Those two words changed everything. 3 days earlier, Wesley had reached the cabin carrying copies of newly discovered flood assessments. The teacher had independently uncovered many of the same concerns documented by Elias. Together, they planned to bring everything forward. Then someone began following Wesley, not to kill him, to stop him. Frightened, the pair separated. Wesley fled deeper into the wetlands, hoping to draw attention away from Elias. Search teams immediately expanded operations. 2 days later, they found him, exhausted, dehydrated, but alive. The truth proved less dramatic than the rumors. A regional consulting firm connected to old flood control contracts had learned Wesley was investigating historical records. Several individuals attempted intimidating him into abandoning his research. Nothing more, nothing supernatural, nothing cinematic. Just ordinary people trying desperately to prevent damaging information from resurfacing, and ultimately failing. The archive changed everything. State investigations expanded. Historical records were reopened. Engineering reviews launched. Long-ignored flood vulnerabilities received funding. Communities finally gained access to information hidden for decades. But for Boone, the most important moment came weeks later. After the reporters left, after the investigators departed, after the headlines faded, a public gathering took place outside Mercy River Chapel. Hundreds attended. Residents from surrounding parishes arrived. Some came seeking closure. Others came seeking accountability. Most came simply to hear the truth. For the first time in nearly 40 years, Elias stood in public. The elderly contractor looked out at the crowd, then toward the church, toward the flood-scarred town, toward the people he had spent decades trying to protect. His voice trembled when he spoke. "I thought preserving the evidence was enough." Silence filled the air. "I was wrong." People listened. The truth only matters when someone is willing to carry it into the light. Then he looked directly at Boone and Gideon. The old German shepherd lay beside his handler beneath an oak tree, gray-muzzled, tired. Watching quietly, Elias smiled. "If that dog hadn't refused to quit," his voice broke, "none of you would be standing here today." The crowd applauded, but Boone wasn't looking at them. He was looking at Gideon, because he finally understood. The flood had exposed parts of the hidden structure. Water had disturbed decades-old scent pathways trapped within sealed spaces. When Wesley entered the chamber and later traveled between the church, cemetery, and concealed storage areas, he unknowingly left fresh scent trails, connected to locations containing Elias's records. Gideon's training had done the rest. The retired K-9 wasn't solving mysteries. He was doing exactly what he'd done his entire career, detecting patterns, following scent relationships, refusing to ignore what his instincts recognized. The old dog never knew about archives, or flood control corruption, or missing contractors. He simply knew something connected those places, and he trusted his training enough to keep pointing toward it. Weeks later, Mercy River Chapel reopened, not as a symbol of secrecy, but as a symbol of truth finally revealed. The hidden archive was preserved. The underground chamber became part of a local historical exhibit, and Delacroix Crossing slowly began rebuilding. One evening, months after everything ended, Boone sat on his porch watching the sun disappear beyond the marshes. Gideon rested beside him. The old shepherd's breathing was slower now. Age was catching up. Boone gently scratched behind his ears. "You stubborn old fool." Gideon opened one eye, then closed it again. Content. Peaceful. For the first time since the flood, he seemed completely relaxed. The mystery was over. The trail had ended. The work was done. As darkness settled across the Louisiana wetlands, Boone looked toward the distant church steeple rising above the trees. A flood had uncovered a hidden staircase. A staircase had revealed a sealed chamber. A chamber had protected an archive. An archive had exposed a forgotten truth. And through every twist, every false lead, every buried secret, one retired police dog had refused to walk away. Not because he understood the mystery, but because somewhere beneath the noise, the fear, and the lies, he smelled that something important had been left behind, and he wasn't about to let anyone forget it.